بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the next episode of the Islamic Book Review podcast with myself and Dr. Zishan, Hafidhahullah. Today we have a very interesting episode with a mix of topics. But before we want to get into all of that, please do ensure to join our Telegram channel, where all of the things that we talk about in terms of resources, reading, etc. is posted. So if you want to access those things to read by yourselves, then it's possible to do so. Also, follow us on social media, the Imam Zakaria Academy Instagram page, etc. Subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and leave a comment or two with suggestions of books that you want us to review next, or with your points of your own that we can also reflect upon, inshaAllah ta'ala. Moving swiftly on, something that has been circulating around in the sphere of social media, on Twitter, it became a Twitter storm, as they say, is a discussion regarding the authenticity, the veracity of the sciences of hadith, and whether they stack up against the Western academic literature, whether they are robust enough to handle the testing by Western academics. And there was some comments made online alluding, maybe more than alluding, to the fact that perhaps they don't stack up too much, and that the Western academic study of hadith is more rigorous, more robust, and we have to revisit that whole framework. I want to bring in Maulana Zishan on this. What's your takeaway, or what's your initial thoughts on it? What were your initial thoughts when we started off in this?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Nahmadu salli wa nusallim ala rasulih al-kareem. Amma ba'd. So just to clarify, clarification a number of times that I'm not on social media. So on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, anything like that, I'm not on it. Even this channel, I don't actually have access to the channel myself. So every messages that will go through the admin to myself. So I'm not on social media like that.
It's usually someone that sends you these things.
Yeah, so someone sends it and says, give your thoughts on it. So we're now recording, it's the 21st of July.
21st, yeah.
21st July. So things change rapidly. And this is one of the reasons I don't like commenting upon live things, because things shift in a few days. So by the time this may come out in a week or week and a half's time, the conversation could have radically changed. So it's always good to make points which are not so time-bound, because we're not doing running commentary. So that's not the purpose of the channel to run. The purpose of the channel, hopefully, or our discussions are that you can come in 3-4 years' time and still have relevance to what we're talking about. So, of course, the clip is of Shiyas al-Qadi speaking about the historical critical method versus the traditional method of hadith science. Now, as far as I know, and again, I'm not following the content, he's said, look, that's what you guys are assuming that I said I did not say. So we take his explanation for that. I'm not here to do like a investigation to his personal views. I'm pretty sure I'll take his word for it and saying that didn't mean or didn't, so I only saw the clip. I've not, as people assume from me is not what I'm saying, which is to suggest that the historical critical method is a superior method to hadith analysis. But it becomes an excuse to talk about it. Mm-hmm. So for us, the benefit we can take is, all right, whether he meant it or not, or whatever the discussion is, because it's a topic that we are interested in, it gives us an excuse to maybe discuss it. So I'm going to mention a couple of points. Number one is, if you go right back to our first podcast, we did a review of the book Min al-Nabi al-Bukhari, and we also did a book of a review by the individual called Pavel Pavlovich, if you recall that, right in the first episode. Mm-hmm. I would advise people to go back and listen to that. And there, although we didn't talk about historical critical method as a thing, mm-hmm. Pavel Pavlovich is an Orientalist who works within the prism of what is referred to as historical critical method. And we provide a critique of his methods and his conclusions and some of the absurdities in that. Yeah. And then we had the Min al-Nabi al-Bukhari, which was an example of what I would say is a robust defense of the I'll still call it historical critical method of the Islamic method, or we could say the hadith, the traditional hadith method of doing narrator analysis. Now, so there's a couple of comments on 2 points I want to mention. We can move on because there's a reason why I'm only making 2 comments. Number one is that when you talk about the idea of a historical critical method, this is not a thing, right? It's not like, okay, here's the method, which is just kind of taken from study or biblical studies and then developed as a method of how to study history. And then you can just take that method and let's say, okay, let's apply it to Islam. So here's a method, A, B, C, just apply it to Islam or apply it to these sources and we can see what the conclusion is. No, historical critical method just refers to certain premises, markers to look out for, so anachronisms,
Yes.
earlier source, the better, biases, there are different types of biases, political, theological, etc. And looking that within the text to see if those are there, to find markers of when we can date certain reports. And many of those elements are found within traditional hadith sciences.
What we know as qara'in.
Qara'in as well, yeah, 100%. So you have qara'in indications that we look at, and we basically try to observe those things. So there are examples where a hadith, it supports Sunni Islam, all right? So what becomes mainstream Sunni Islam, there could be a theological point clearly mentioned in a hadith, but then that hadith has been referred to as being a fabrication, right? And this would be a combination of looking at the content of the narration as well as the narrators of the narration. Yeah. So the idea of what we call the historical critical method, the many various elements of that are already found within that. So what exactly is it then? What we have is this kind of hyper-skepticism which fluctuates the spectrum. So if you want to look at, if you want to talk as a group, say, okay, what is the historical critical method applied to hadith? There's about 4 or 5 key figures that are influential when it comes to study of hadith from Orientalists. So we have people like Ignaz Goldziher, Joseph Schacht, John Ball, Motzki, although he's more favorable. And then you have more extreme method, Norman Kelder, and more recent times, people like Joshua Little that have, and that's more or less it. So I want to see what the method is. And if you can, we're happy to go through each one, and people have gone through each method and shown the discrepancies and the inconsistencies in application of those methods.
Yeah.
And they're very different in the way they approach it. So it's not, here is our historical critical method and we're just going to apply the method and see what the conclusions come to. There's a spectrum of how those methods are applicable, and it's very loose.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. So
just to add on to that, not only that, but when they took it from their biblical studies, they had to change it and mold it to fit the corpus that they were looking at, because that's the very nature of it, right? So it's asymmetric, the comparison between the two. So it's completely different. And they look at it in a very specific way with their own biases, which comes through completely from the beginning. Like you see it again and again and again. And when ulama of the past have responded to them, they point out those biases that, no, your bias is coming up again. Your bias is coming up again. And that's where the biggest falling point for them is.
That's like the famous critique of Orientalism. The idea was that we're going to come and study the text objectively because we are outsiders, because we're not Muslims. We are objective in our analysis. And you just have to go back, don't take our word for it, just go back and look at some of the 19th, early 20th century studies, and you'll see the bias dripping through. It's just at that time, they're not conscious of their biases. Yeah. And we become more aware of our biases. The second point I want to mention about the historical critical method and with Orientalist studies, I was just having a conversation just yesterday with Mufti Muntasir Zaman. And so this is kind of, pushed us to, we're gonna begin, I'm going to mention it publicly because then it forces us to write it, right? So we've agreed to kind of call for a piece where we talk about the historical critical method in a robust way. And by mentioning it publicly, the purpose is to kind of force us now, because people say, well, you're going to write something, so bring it out. So that's why I'm mentioning it. And one of these points that we were just having a discussion on.
Before you go on to the point, I think you've written an article previously, a very brief one, albeit, on the...
so we looked at some of the famous Orientalist studies on hadith and just mentioned some of the flaws within it. Yeah. That's already online. I'm happy to share it again on Telegram channel if you guys want to go up. I'll happy to share that, inshallah. But what we were trying to highlight was that I remember reading one of these critiques was that, you see, the historical critical method is very broad in its analysis, whereas traditional hadith analysis is very restricted to a narrator. And this shows you the problem of hadith analysis, which is theistic. So it's very narrow in its application, whereas we have much of a broad, holistic type of approach. Now, the nonsensical aspect of this is that the most recent study, which we'll be also looking at in terms of critique, of Joshua Little, for those who are aware, they're aware. If they don't worry about it too much. But it's basically, the argument being is that we take a narrator, and we take his hadith. And then what we do about the narrator is that we say, okay, who is he narrating from? And what's the content of that? And what does it support? So if you have, like in the case of Joshua Little, he's looking at Hisham ibn Urwa. And Hisham ibn Urwa narrates from his father Urwa, who narrates from Aisha anha. So now the hadith is about the age of Aisha and how old was she? Yeah. So he's going to look at that narration in isolation and see how do other people narrate it, what could be the biases, etc. And he comes to this kind of very bizarre conclusion that this is some sort of fabrication for whatever purpose he's trying to justify, which we'll be dealing with, inshallah. That's not the purpose right now. But the hadith method is not that. right? The traditional method is actually far more robust. It's saying, okay, this Hisham ibn Urwa, we're not going to look at one narration of his. What is he as a narrator? How does Hisham ibn Urwa and his narration from his father stack up with others who narrate from Urwa, right? And you look at a holistic study of Hisham ibn Urwa, and then you see, okay, let's say Bukhari would do this, Ali Madini would do it, Yahya Ma'in would do this. Or look at him and say, as a full study of his narrations, we see that this person is very consistent. His reports are usually, or for the vast majority of the time, are corroborated. He's narrating from his father. There's been positive things about the person. So therefore, we have no reason to distrust a report of Hisham ibn Urwa. Doesn't mean he can't make a mistake. Yeah. That's why every trustworthy narrator has examples of mistakes that they made.
Which they will clearly point out.
And they will actively point this out. Now, the point here is that what's a more robust method of taking one person's report and saying, let's focus in on this one thing that they have said and see whether this is accurate or not, or taking that person in a much more holistic fashion and seeing what is he or what does he stack up as a narrator, which is taking into consideration his peers, what they've said about him, looking at his narrations, whether he's corroborated, who does he claim to narrate from, and then the content of his report. Is he narrating absurdities, for example, that no one else seems to be aware of?
Add on to that, when you then look at the narrator as like a more holistic picture, and you're looking at his other narrations in order to make sure that he's correctly reporting one narration, you're looking at 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 narrations. To now ascertain whether he's corroborated or not necessitates you need to now look at that narration wherever it's found to find out what's the correct version, what's the other wordings. That takes an infinitely long time.
And this is the point that just because I was having the conversation with Mufti Muntasir and he sent me this just image from Iftikhar Zaman's paper. It's very nice what he mentioned as well. And what he says in there is that you have to remember that people like Yahya Ma'in, I just look at him as an example, right? If I said to you, what's the fiqh of Yahya Ma'in? What is fatawa? Would you have much? No. If I said other ulum, other sciences, what did Yahya Ma'in do? Not much. So Yahya Ma'in was someone that was not doing a 3-year PhD dissertation. He was not someone that was, teaching in the daytime and having a job and then doing some hadith in his spare time. These are people that were dedicated to narrators and doing exactly this day and night. Yeah. So it's not arguing from authority because the authority you have to accept it. But you have to understand what they did. We're talking about what's a robust method.
Their occupation was that.
So these people are going to be looking at narrators in this fashion. And then we have a number of people doing that. So that's Yahya Ma'in, one person. So you have a number of people that are doing that. And they're not part of one team. Constantly debating each other, disputing, saying who is and who isn't trustworthy. Constantly under the microscope saying, are you being biased here or not in your critique or your praise? That's the robust method of hadith analysis that we have. And you compare that to someone his main field of analysis will be language. Main field of analysis is politics. And then they take a 5-year stint in studying hadith and then they want to come back and become a hadith expert or try to say, look, our method is far more robust than the method that was said from before. Again, this is not an argument from authority because we can demonstrate the difference as well. So let's be clear here. Yeah. I've always tried to say this, that yes, you can make an argument from authority, say, look at the difference in terms of competency. And that's important because as a layperson, you're going to come across and say, okay, we got one person that studied this much.
Mr.
This one say, and then you got someone who studied that much and a bunch of them. Yeah. Right? So now, rationally you can say that, but you argue, say, but isn't the argument from authority? So fine. So you don't want to go by authority, let's go with the detail then. Yeah. And that's where we can go through these details we've done. So that's why I said go to the first podcast on Pavel Pavlovich and we've gone through the documentation of the mistakes and the errors in methodology. So it's not just a thing of because Imam Bukhari was so great, follow him. We're saying, no, we can show you the greatness of Imam Bukhari. There's been numerous works in Arabic that have come out that have gone through individual narrators, collecting their narrations, and then showing you exactly why this person was deemed as they were deemed, demonstrated. So it wasn't that, Yahya Ma'in liked this guy, so he said he's trustworthy, or didn't like him, he said he's weak. Demonstrate exactly the weakness, the nature of the weakness that we can actually see with our own eyes. Yeah. And those are volumes regarding one narrator. Yeah. And we're talking about thousands of narrators. Right? So if you were to do on one narrator, that would be your PhD dissertation. Yeah. Right? If you don't know one narrator, that would be a PhD dissertation. We were talking about Sheikh Hatim before. His master's dissertation, which is 4 volumes, was just on Hassan al-Basri. Right? That's his master's dissertation. Now you can imagine that being done now for each narrator. Yep. That can only be done by someone who doesn't do anything else, just this day and night. Yep. That's what you're up against. Fine. You may still be more correct. You may have a deeper insight. Then let's look at the content of what you produce. Yeah. And by looking at the content of what you produce, we can then expose the absurdities that come out from this. Yeah. And it's been done, and we'll do it again, inshallah. But just something have to be clear that on both elements, whether it's in terms of authority or whether in terms of the content, the flaws of that method can easily be critiqued. And historical critical method isn't this kind of model that you just apply. It's a spectrum of principles that are very much within the method of traditional hadith science, which is by its very nature the rational discipline.
Yeah.
Because where did you get hadith science from? Was saying, how do we know someone's telling the truth?
Yeah, exactly.
So that very basic principles that we have, that we apply in our day-to-day life to find out if someone's accurate or not, that was then incorporated within the hadith science.
Yeah.
To make sure that we can then ascertain these principles. So each one of those principles is a rational principle that we could demonstrate why we're applying this. That's why you can be a person who's affiliated to Shi'ism, but be a trustworthy hadith narrator. And you could be someone who's an imam of sunnah in the sense that your aqeedah is sound, but you could be da'if in hadith.
Yeah.
You can be a qari of the Quran that everyone goes to and listens to Quran from you and very precise and praised, but you can be weak in hadith because when you transmit hadith, you're not as meticulous.
Yeah, yeah.
Because it's a rational science.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's when I say that. I don't want to mention too much on it, but we will be writing a paper on this, inshallah. And just to mention it publicly, just so we force ourselves to do it.
We look forward to reading that paper because hadith is that battleground where when you excel, it's a very big thing. And to contribute to that science is a very noble and praiseworthy thing to aspire to as well. But moving on from that discussion, because we don't want to spend too long on that, we have very limited time. Is that we want to go through, or we want to first actually mention a shout out for a book regarding the virtue of reciting Ayatul Kursi, Ayatul Kursi after the Fara'id, after Fard Salah, by Uthman bin Fayruz.
Yeah, Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, based in the UK.
Yes.
This is called Tanazzul Rahmat بقراءة آية الكرسي عقب المكتوبات. Just like when we put the picture on Telegram channel, if you can put it up on the screen now, it'd be great as well. If you can't see, this is the book. It's a relatively short work, but I actually bought this book a while back, and then the author contacted me saying, have you had the chance, can I send you a copy? And I said to him, I actually got a copy. And so now you mention it, I briefly looked at it before, but I'm going to read for it thoroughly. And so, but I did say to him, I will speak about the book, but if I don't find the book good, I will mention I don't like the book, right? So just to be clear here, right? It's not like, if you're my friend and then I'll praise you.
In the interest of truth.
Yeah, interest of truth. So, it's a double-edged sword. So you may say, give my book a shout out, but it not be the shout out that you're looking for, right? But alhamdulillah, this book, I've actually went through it quite thoroughly. I was actually being very meticulous as well, trying to make sure. And it's the hadith which mentions the virtue of reciting Ayatul Kursi after your fard salahs, your obligatory prayers. And just to be clear, because of this book, right, I've actually incorporated that in my own practice because it makes a very good case for the authenticity of the hadith. This is something which many of the classical scholars authenticate, but there were some contemporary discussions that have attempted to weaken the hadith. It's just an analysis of hadith. So what the author has done, Uthman bin Fayruz, is that he's gone through the major problems that have been highlighted about the hadith. First goes off to talk about who narrates the hadith, or takhrij, the variation in wordings, what's the most accurate wording, and then he goes into the isnad and he studies the chain and what the various scholars have said about the narrators, and those who are more harsh, why they were more harsh. And then he provides a response to each of them very thoroughly, right? Very convincingly, I would say. And at the end, what he's also done, which is very good, is taken some contemporary scholars, right? Sheikh Hatim is cited, Sheikh Nasrullah Alwan, I think is, and one other person, I can't remember the name right now. And they're contemporary scholars who've also authenticated the hadith and why they've accepted it, right? Because there's a discussion about tafarrud that goes into it that he discusses in some detail. And at the end, he's put a juz fi kalam ala hadith, but so there's a discussion regarding the hadith about this hadith by Imam Taqiyuddin as-Subki. He's put that at the end. He's also got a discussion in the middle where he talks about some of the fiqh related to it, what the fuqaha have said. But just focusing on the hadith part of it, he makes a very good case for the authenticity of the hadith, citing from the primary sources. Everything has gone to the primary original sources. Even in the footnotes, you'll see some corrections he's made to earlier scholars. He's also listed all the scholars that authenticated it, called it Hasan, called it Jayyid, called it Da'if, or called it Worse. And then gone through exactly why they said it. So like, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah, this was a practice of his, but despite that, he weakened the narration. So then there's different explanations for that. So he's gone into that, the various explanations. So it's worth a shout out. UK-based scholar, I've always said that because we don't have much scholarship going on in the UK, especially in Arabic language, for those who do write something, I will try to mention their work positive. If there is there, I'll mention it, inshallah. So this is one work out there, published in Maktaba Ismail as well again. For those who are interested in hadith or interested in this, well worth it. And of course, the most important thing about these kind of studies is to adopt them in my life. So if there's a authentic narration telling us that whoever recites Ayatul Kursi after every Fard Salah, there's nothing to prevent Jannah except death, which is the hadith that we're talking about, then it's an easy thing to incorporate into our lives and we should do so. So there's after some ilm, there should be some amal, inshallah.
Definitely. Okay. Now, the main meat of this episode is regarding the autobiography/biography of a very well-known scholar, Sheikh Hussain Ahmad Madani. He wrote a book called Naqsh Hayat. It's in Urdu, so I've not actually read the Urdu version. I can't read Urdu. So Maulana Zishan read the Urdu. I read the translation, which was published by Turath and was edited by Ismail Patel. This is a brilliant book. I think I read it for the first time. Sheikh Hussain Ahmad Madani and Maulana Zishan can actually speak about it in much more detail.
What you do, you review it,
Yeah.
what you got, and this is additional points that I will mention after. So
Yeah, this was going to do, yeah. That be going to cut out, yeah.
No, keep it in there.
Okay, so Sheikh Hussain Ahmad Madani, he's well known for his political activism regarding the colonial period of, of freedom and independence from British colonial rule in India. That's what he was known for. Him being imprisoned multiple times, especially with his teacher, for the sake of working for that cause of Indian independence from the British colonial rule. There's a wider historical context to that in terms of partition and becoming part of Pakistan or remaining as a complete India, and a discussion between the scholars regarding that. He has a role to play in that as well, but he's more well known for his freedom fighting that he did. What is not mentioned about him, or is mentioned about him in more academic circles, which he talks about at the beginning of his book when he talks about his studies and his early teaching life, is that he was quite well-read and he was a very intelligent student. He went to Medina and he taught for a number of years in Medina to Munawwara a number of subjects ranging from Nahu to Hadith as well, if I'm not mistaken. And then when he returned and he became the principal and the Shaykh al-Hadith of Darul Uloom Deoband, if I'm correct, that's when his political engagement started. So something which is always interesting to note about certain scholars is that, like as you mentioned about Yahya ibn Ma'in, for example, al-Imam, right? Sometimes you read about them in one kind of focus, one kind of lens so much, you may tend to forget the other facets to their identity, to their scholarly life. So that was very interesting to read about Sheikh Hussain Ahmad Madani in terms of his ilmi academic engagement, and then as well as his political engagements that he had. Now, what I found interesting from this book, or a takeaway, I guess, is that, and this is an opinion of mine, is that as a fraternity, Deobandis have decidedly become very politically quiet, I think, in the UK. On a general level, they are politically active members within the Deobandi fraternity, but on a whole, we're quite politically quietist. Sheikh Hussain Ahmad Madani is like a polar opposite to that, where it was like a complete engagement in politics with a firm resolve to change the political landscape, which was quite interesting to see. And I think the biggest lesson from that is that we should not shy away from engaging with the political landscape that we're in order to improve and further our own agenda, just like every other community or fraternity or a group are trying to further their own agendas as well within that framework. I think that was my biggest takeaway from this book as a whole. I want to let Maulana Zishan talk about it more because he has read the full 2-volume work in Urdu and may have much more fawaid because it's an abridged work with many things kind of dropped from it to make it brief and readable, digestible for the poor English reader like me. Yeah.
Right. So excellent points, inshallah. So they're just talking about focused on the political activism around Madani, which is known for, and also he's been given the laqab of Shaykh al-Islam.
Yeah.
So from the scholars of Deoband, there's 2 scholars that have been given the title Shaykh al-Islam. One is Shaykh al-Islam Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, and then there's Shaykh al-Islam Maulana Shabir Ahmad Uthmani. These are the 2 well-known Shaykh al-Islam, and now you see the title also being used for Muqtadi Uthmani as well. So I'm sure others have called others, but these are the 2 famous ones. And it's fine, Maulana Shabir Ahmad Uthmani was the one that was pushing Pakistan, pro-Pakistan, and then Maulana Madani was pro-India. So, you have like a Shaykh al-Islam on both sides. I'm not too sure where the origins of that come from, but it would be interesting to see, like, maybe it's to try to disperse both as the authorities being Shaykh al-Islam. Allah Ta'ala knows best. But anyway, so this book, so how many pages have we got in there?
So this is a total of, so if I don't include the appendices,
Yeah.
Just go to the last page here.
Roughly, wherever it is.
I think it's about 140 odd pages. I don't know the exact number. It's about 150 pages.
All right, so it's quite small. So in comparison to the 2-volume Naqsh Hayat, or you combine 1 volume as well, it's about 700 pages you're looking at, about 650 pages is the original. So you can see how condensed it is.
171 pages.
Whatever the issue is, right? So it's quite a condensed version, as you said. And so he's kind of selected from there what is relevant. And that's important. I'll explain why it's important as well. The only thing I would say about the translation which has been useful is that if they had made notes to tell us exactly what part they're translating, it will be easier for one to refer to the original. So right now, because you have a condensed version, if there's a point mentioned there, it's very difficult to locate what they're talking about. It's actually one section in there where he talks about, we'll come to it, about Maulana Madani's participating in a debate. And I was very intrigued by it. So I was like, well, I wonder where that's going to come up. And it literally comes up in the last 20 pages. So I was on page 680. And that's when that story comes up. So it can be a while trying to look, so if they had maybe just had one edition of Naqsh Hayat in front of the original Urdu and just highlighted saying, do it from this page, and we're kind of skipping stuff, then it would have made sense. Now, Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, of course, one of the most famous scholars of Deoband. There's these, these luminaries that we hear about, the likes of Maulana Qasim al-Utbi, Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, Hakim al-Ummah, Maulana Ashfari Thanwi, and then we've gone into these figures like Allama Kashmiri, Maulana Madani, Mufti Kifayatullah, Maulana Zafar Usmani, Maulana Shabir Ahmad Usmani, Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi. These names are just, they come one, and the fact is they're all at a very similar time. They lived, many of them, over similar time periods, and they're all like, very comprehensive scholars of their own right. So they had scholarly output, political output, khidmah, whatever, in various forms. So these are very, it's an amazing time to study, a period for people to study. Now, Maulana Madani stands out is because just some history over here is that, and he talks about this, the reason why that's so condensed is because a large section of this book just talks about British colonization and the evils of it. So how do we get to a place where Darul Deoband becomes recognized as being anti-establishment? So the reality is that pre-mutiny, so 1856 mutiny, pre-mutiny, the ulama are mixed in terms of how to deal with this new power, the British, that are taking over. So there's fatwa given, some want to be more in a nice relationship, others are recognizing the evils of what the British are doing, the foreigners. And so you eventually get to the time of the mutiny. After the mutiny is crushed, now you kind of recognize that the British are in charge and we can't do anything about it. So a lot of these institutions and scholars and figures, they shift their method. So now it's like, look, the British are in charge. They give you relative freedom. So you can establish madrasas, you can establish stuff, right? They are stealing from the land, right? But we can still do our da'wah, etc. So you get this kind of period where a lot of scholars become quite accepting of British rule. So even Darul Deoband, if you look at that period, and there's some examples I've cited on the Telegram channel from before, where you have the actual madrasa having very positive positions about the British.
Public notice.
The public notice I shared last time from Muhammad Qasim Zaman's work as well, I demonstrated last time, or I translated actually, I got it translated rather. Now, that period of being quite, that's where you even get titles given by the British. So Shamsul Ulama was a title given to some. So like we have knighthood. So titles were given by the British. Now what happens is, a lot of folks today, when they're doing sectarian debates, they will say, look, your scholar who died in 1890 was all, lovey-dovey with the British. So you guys are spies, you're actually British agents. And then they'll say, but your scholar was also doing this. And the reality is that most scholars were doing that at that time, not because of, ulterior agendas necessarily, just the fact that that's the reality we're living in. Yeah. Just like, for example, we live in the UK, you have scholars that go meet the politicians. They rule.
It's just their way of engagement.
Yeah, exactly. So you rule. So if I write a letter to say, thank you, Keir Starmer, for cleaning up the streets or giving permission, right? But that's the ruling elite. So people sometimes say those kind of comments, right? You can come back in hindsight and say, you should have, but you're not living in the time we're living in. But then once it gets to a stage, so Maulana Madani kind of lists the evils of the British. And so his teacher, Sheikh al-Hind, who gets it out, Mahmud Hassan, he gets to this conclusion that the biggest evil that we're dealing with is the British. They're the ones that need to go out. And this is where you get this this kind of repugnance to all thing Western, even the English language. So there are these kind of anecdotes you read about, like never learning English, right? And being proud of that. And then that stereotype comes where it's like, these Maulvis don't learn English because they're backwards. So even Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, which comes later on in the book, and actually, I don't know if it's in the translation or not, he mentions that we're not against learning English, right? But it's because what English is a gateway to. And of course, it would be weird for us to support that fatwa because we speak English, right? But he was never done as a fatwa. It was a point of saying, we are taking as an identity we're trying to preserve.
Language is a window to culture.
100%, yeah. So when you go, so look at those who learn English, what they're going to end up doing, right? Those who do English, study in college and universities, look what the lifestyle they're living, because it comes as a package deal.
Yeah.
So you get this kind of very negative view towards the British, and it's a whole thing about how to oust the British, right? So a large section of the book is that, these kind of details of the British, where they've taken out, because I understand, because there's a lot of tables, but what I was impressed by was the depth of knowledge that Maulana Madani had in regards to these kind of works. So these are like books in English that have been translated into Urdu that Maulana Madani is engaging with. And he's reading them thoroughly, and then he's paraphrasing the content of those works, listing the type of theft that the British had done. Now, before we move on to this, I just want to start with his early life, and I found it very nice, the early life of Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani. So he comes from a family, so they're Sayyids. So in the beginning of the work, Maulana Madani on page 26 in the Urdu edition, Dawra Ishaat, copy I'm reading from, right? I can't remember if it's in the English or not, right? He talks about, he's a Sayyid, but then he talks about the nasab with the amal doesn't mean much.
Yeah.
Right? So despite him coming from a Sayyid, he does say, look, there is a sharaf, the nobility to that. But that should not then translate as being, the excuse to not do righteous deeds. And his father himself was was also a noble person, his mother and his grandmother. So his father has this kind of, when they're quite young, he has this desire to say, I want to go and do hijrah to Medina. And so he's like to everyone, look, you come, everyone has to come, right? And they're struggling. Now people have to remember that even, I'll just send some anecdote here as well, but normally when people think of Medina, right, you think of those nice hotels, the coolness of Medina, and when you're there for a week or two in Umrah, it's very nice, etc., right? But the difficulty of living in Medina without, which you think before all these kind of hotels that were there, was very difficult. It's not easy place to climatize to. And I only noticed this because I used to hear like the migration of Medina. Then I hear about Medina, it's amazing, right? So you're with the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But it was only when I went Hajj last year that we were given like a hotel very far away, right? It's a good 20-25 minute walk. And so when you go outside that vicinity of the masjid in the local hotels, and then you get into the back roads,
where there's no AC.
When the AC is less, the houses are small, you think, okay, I can understand why it would be very difficult living here.
Yeah.
So then, and that's now still,
Yeah.
but you still have electricity, etc. So when Madani and family moved, they struggled extensively. And he talks about it in detail, about the difficulties in Medina. So of course, at one side, you have the sharaf of being in Medina, and you can't ever downplay that. But the difficulty of day-to-day life is something that's also significant.
Yeah.
And he writes that a lot of his family members, brothers, children, etc., passed away in Medina. It doesn't give you the reason if it's for Medina itself, but a lot of people passed away. There was a lot of infancy death anyway, but a lot of people passed away. And he mentions that his father buried from 33 to 35 family members in Medina, right? That's a significant blow, right? So he talks, but the way he lost his wives, multiple. He only had one wife at a time, but he lost a couple of wives of his, children of his. He had a brother who was very knowledgeable, very eloquent. He passed away, I think, at like late teenage years. So, but the reality of like the way Maulana Madani talks about it, you can see it hurts him, but there is this kind of level of tawakkul and understanding that they just get along, they just kind of go along with it. Yeah. So like he doesn't want to go to a certain place. Father says, I end up going, right? I went thinking I'll go here. My sheikh said it, or I'm gone. And this kind of just understanding that that life itself is imperfect. And I think this is something that you get with these kind of autobiographies, because you see people in their real like self. And I think we have a desire to kind of perfect life. And so because there's a seemingly control that we can perfect life to a degree. So it's attainable. So anytime life throws a curveball, it's something that we don't know how to react to, right? It's like, how do I react to this? But when you read like the amount of losses he's going through, the struggles he's going through, right? He talks about when they finally had the opportunity to build a house. I'll really advise people to read the Urdu. I don't know how it's in English, but he built a house. And he goes, he was teaching in Medina.
Yeah.
And then his father would say, look, the builder's not in today, so you come. So then he would have to go and then and they're talking about one of these senior scholars at this time, right? Yeah. He also discusses in there like the issue of when he first started teaching lower books, no one really cared. Once you start getting a bit of influence, jealousy starts creeping in. So people start, speaking ill of him. In Medina, he talks about when Maulana Sahanpuri came. So by that time, Maulana Madani was quite influential, right? Big time. He was teaching a lot of books, by the way, that were not in the Indian's curriculum. So he lists those other type of books that were Qatrun Nada, etc., which is not done in Indian curriculum. So he was teaching those as well. When Maulana Sahanpuri comes to India, so we're talking around the late 19th, early 20th century, we're talking that period. This is about 19 or something, right? When he comes, that's the time where he documents the whole background to Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan. Because when Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan comes to the Hijaz to get the fatwa signed of doing takfir, excommunicating the 4 Deobandi scholars, Maulana Madani is in Medina at that time, right? So he documents what happens. And that is actually one of the reasons why he actually writes his books. He doesn't write many books. Right? If you look at the output of Maulana Madani, you have his autobiography, you have his time in prison, you have a lot of articles about politics, about the making of Pakistan, you have that. You have his small book on Muttahida Qawmit, we'll come to in a second. And we also have like his letters. And then we have this book of Shihab al-Thaqib, which kind of stands out in front of all these other works. So Shihab al-Thaqib is his work, which is a refutation of the book Husam al-Haramain by Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan. So he talks about that in Naqsh Hayat, how that happened, and then because there's already like a bit of a jealousy for Maulana Khalil, etc. So there was people already pouncing onto that because of this. So it's very fascinating. So he talks about the reality of things, and he also kind of takes with the romanticization of going to Medina. What I mean by this is that when people migrate, do hijrah, right? You sometimes get sold the idea. You go there, masjid is right there. It's gonna be, but then you have. Okay, that's an hour, 2 hours of your life, but you still got 22 hours to make up for it,
livelihood
right?
To earn.
Exactly, livelihood to earn. So they talk about a time where outside Medina they had a shop.
Yeah.
Shop wasn't working, so they were struggling with that, trying to make an income. Struggling, a real struggle, full proper mujahid that they went through. And so when they come back to India, they feel a calm in India.
Yeah.
When they come to Deoband's like their own place. They can eat whenever they want. So everyone, they know everyone. So that's their home. But he really his father then eventually doesn't. So after burying so many of his family members in Medina, his father passes away when Maulana Madani is in Malta, in prisons of Malta. So this is after the Sheikh al-Hind is taken to prison. He's taken prison with him. So his father passes away, but he doesn't pass away in Medina. So despite all of that, he himself doesn't pass away in Medina. So these are like, fascinating insights that life doesn't work the way we think it's going to work.
Yeah.
Where you bury 33 plus of your members in family in Medina, but the guy who's behind that doesn't get the burial in Medina. Allah knows best what the wisdom behind all of these things are, but it's something fascinating to keep in. But it does take away from the fact that life's not in our control, so we don't know despite our planning. So the autobiographies kind of show that, and it also shows you that despite all of these struggles, the consistency of how you kind of continue your reading and studying alongside the different curveballs of life.
Yeah.
So just this morning I was teaching about the biography of Sheikh Abdul Rahman Muallimi. So if you look at Sheikh Abdul Rahman Muallimi's life, he was someone that had pure tafarruq for ilm. So meaning he was just dedicated to it. Morning to night, he was in Dawud Ma'arif Uthmani Hyderabad, 26 years, dedicated to ilm. Right? And then he's finally gets a position in the Haram Makki library in Mecca, and he gets his room is in the library. So he used to only come out for his 5 daily salahs, and then the rest of it he was studying, teaching and stuff within the library itself. So the content kind of demonstrates that. So it's very hard for a lot of us who don't have that lifestyle to relate to it. Because, well, who's going to have that luxury of having a job that they can just be full-time studying, right? It's very few people that can do it. Even those who do, who maximizes the opportunity.
Exactly.
But with people like Maulana Madani, a lot of these figures, they were multifaceted. So that they have their teaching positions they have, the travels they do, the political activism, the bayans they're doing, the conferences they're doing. And then you have their personal life, the struggles of that comes about, the losing of children, the losing of his spouse, etc. So all of that, alongside trying to maintain knowledge, that's what I think is so inspirational about reading these autobiographies, that you can actually incorporate those things in your life. And it takes away sometimes this idea that, because when you speak about the scholars in the past, in these kind of idealistic versions, then they're not people that you can emulate. Because if I was to speak about someone like Sheikh Muallimi, for example, and say, look at Sheikh Muallimi, and the listeners are listening to this, and you're listening to this, you think, that's a nice story, but that's not my life, right? If I did that, I could. But then when I say, look at Maulana Madani's life, you have no excuse, right? Because the time that you have is probably more the time that he had. But the achievements that he made is far more than the achievements that we have. So it does show you the shortcomings that come from our side. So I think these kind of autobiographies, etc., are far more useful. His father was actually Bay'ah to Maulana Fazlur Rahman Ganj Muradabadi, a very famous scholar. That name always, it's got a nice name, Ganj Muradabadi, right? It's the area. So Fazlur was a very famous sheikh. He mentions that he used to do the hookah. And so his father used to do hookah as well. It's actually like a common practice doing hookah, right? And I've actually got about over 100 footnotes that I want to go through, but it's going to be impossible. Also something interesting that come across with Maulana Madani as well, like when you read, because Maulana Madani doesn't have, when you read his Naqsh Hayat, again, I don't know if it comes out in the English or not, right? Because I've just briefly gone through the English, is that there's no ego, right? There's none of this thing of, trying to present yourself more than you actually are. And because of the nature of any field which is competitive, and you have to market yourself, right? If I keep on telling people that I'm nothing, people might start thinking you are nothing, and then I think, okay, but I am something because I had to get some students, so I had to get someone to position to teach, right? So it's a very difficult battle to how do you be honest and say what your qualifications are, and how do you keep your ego intact. So but Maulana Madani, there's just no, and this is, remember, he's writing this after his great success in Medina, his great success in his political battle, where he becomes the sidekick for the hero of India, which is Sheikh al-Hind. He's the main guy. And all the activism he does after that, the accolades that he gets, the title Sheikh al-Islam people giving him. But if you read this, there's no ego. And he talks about when he went to Deoband. So remember, he went from Medina, so he's in Deoband, he's studying in Deoband. He actually failed some exams when he was in his student days. And he mentions it, doesn't hide it. So again, when students sometimes they hear stuff like this, that, I failed. So if I failed, what chance do I have? Because we only hear about these teachers that are geniuses. All right, from a young age, they knew everything. So if you failed, but then if you look at Maulana Madani, right, and you hear, he failed some exams, but then look what he became after that, is something significant. Inshallah.
I think there's a inspiration to draw from the rawness of the image being portrayed by himself, right? Where he's not afraid to show you the things that people would normally be embarrassed or ashamed about, poverty, loss, failure, whatever challenges he faced, because that it gives a person a greater level of inspiration. And if you take it one step further, if you look at the Prophet ﷺ himself, his life was fraught with loss and problems and difficulties. And that was precisely because of the fact that if his life was perfect, right, then no believer would be able to relate to him and take inspiration from his life in the way that we do now, right? But because if the Prophet ﷺ lost children during his life, someone who is coming after looks at that and says, someone has lost, the Prophet ﷺ lost children, and if that's the Prophet ﷺ, he dealt with it in the way he did, I can do the same as well. And that is, you can see that in Sheikh as well.
It's interesting. So, we're talking about how to carry on study. So he mentions here, I'm just trying to look for interesting points. He mentions that he goes, when he was in Deoband, so he had a few trips. So in one place in Deoband, a lot of these scholars, they talk a lot about the sheikhs, those people that were influenced. So Sheikh al-Hind, Maulana Hussain, is spoken about extensively here. Despite him not actually being a sheikh, his spiritual sheikh was Maulana Rashid Gangohi. That was, Maulana Hussain told him to go to Maulana Gangohi and take bay'ah to him. But he mentions this kind of very father-like figure that Maulana Hussain was for him. And he mentions that one time when he's going back to Medina, and this is on page 69, he says that he took me together to the station. So he walked with me to the station, Sheikh al-Hind, that is, Mahmud Hassan. So he goes, Rasta par zor tarike par hidayat farmai ke parana hargiz na chorna. That he told me very forcefully that never stop teaching, right? Because he was going through struggles, etc., family, never stop teaching. And he goes, चाहे एक दो तालिब इल्म ही हो इसलिए तालीम में शगला ख्याल बहुत ज़्यादा हो गया था. Because even if it's just one or two students, it was that this was what really inspired me to carry on teaching, and that's what kept him going. So this is like for those who are graduated or still studying, etc., right? And you're struggling to keep on top of it, force yourself into a class, get a student, get 2 students, just sit them down, right? Once a week, 2-3 times a week, and teach them, and that would continue ticking over what you're doing. And so because that's what kind of really pushed him. And so he's ended up doing like 13, 14 classes a day. His timetable in Medina was crazy in terms of how much he was teaching. And so that there's different ways you can, depending on what you're trying to do. So if you're doing like, if you're going the route of research, then you're going to have to limit your teaching down a bit. So if you look at those scholars that had a lot of scholarly output, they would normally tone down their teaching. So it'd be like after Fajr, after Asr, like 2-3 times, right, a day. And then they'll do a lot of research. But if you're someone that I struggled to keep on top of research, or I don't have the opportunity for that, but I want to carry on my ability and knowledge, then what you do is you increase your classes. So you're kind of forced to learn those books. So what happens is that makes your foundation solid, and it revises the stuff that you're reading, and then you can add to that every now and again. That, okay, I've taught this book, but this I'm going to teach it with this commentary. So then you add that layer to your knowledge, etc. And that's another way. So Maulana Madani goes down this route for learning. So then finally, long story short, when he gets, so the going back to the political aspects of things, right? So there's 2 things I'll mention, and then one last thing. There's a lot of stuff, but one last thing I'm going to talk about as well, right? So he talks about his relation to, remember, at that time, the spiritual head of Darul Deoband was Haji Imdadullah Muhajir Makki, right? On the Telegram channel, I did this kind of some beneficial points regarding from a recent work written on him. You should check it out. Just has some useful information about Haji Imdadullah. So Haji Imdadullah was there in Mecca when Madani first went over, so he would go to see him. So he then talks about Haji Imdadullah's participation in the mutiny, 1857 mutiny. So he talks about his participation in that. And then also how the battle of that took place, and then eventually the need for Haji Imdadullah to migrate towards to Mecca. And he talks about his struggles. So when he went to Mecca, it wasn't easy straight away. So he mentions that Haji Sahib had to survive for days on just Zamzam because no one had no food to eat. And then eventually he kind of settles in there. But then he goes that period, because of the crackdown the British did, the scholars and figures had to play down their involvement. So this is why a lot of because this is a debate that you find in history books in how much did the ulama actually participate in the mutiny.
Yeah.
So like Maulana Gangohi, these figures, how much did they actually participate? Because you look at some of these early sources, they don't mention or they play down the participation. So Maulana Madani mentions it, and Sheikh Zakaria mentions it after as well. He goes, the reason why they played it down was because they'll be arrested.
Yeah.
You can't go and start talking about I did this, I did that, because you'll be arrested. So this is why their participation was played down. And so with the lack of finding that in the early books is because of that, not because of lack of participation. So Allah Ta'ala knows best. But whatever the case is, we have this period of where the madrasa becomes on good terms with the British, but then Shaykh al-Hind, Maulana Mahmud Hassan, who's the Shaykh of Maulana Madani, meaning the teacher of Maulana Madani, him and with other figures. So he lists a number of people that are participating with Maulana Mahmud Hassan. And Mahmud Hassan actually makes a very good point. He goes, if you want to do work, don't try to get the senior scholars on board. Right? Find younger people that are like-minded, they'll be more active in the work. Because naturally, if you have other senior figures, they have their own way of looking at things. So it'll be impossible to ever get together. You know, sometimes they say, get all the senior guys together. Good conversation, but it's very hard to get to a conclusion because everyone has different...
Learn on agreement.
Yeah, because they all have their own different thoughts, right? Which is fine. So you want to do your work, he goes, get lesser people and work with them. So that's what he had. He has like his team. Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi was part of it. And of course, Maulana Madani eventually gets part of it as well.
I think on this as well, that the founders of the very madrasa were all very young when the madrasa of Deoband was founded.
You saw that recently, yeah. So I mentioned that. So we're talking about nearly all of them, except for one, were in their 30s. Yeah. So from the age of 32, and the oldest was 45. And these are those who actually made Darul Deoband that we talk about, right? Anyway, so he talks about that in quite some detail. So about what happened, and we're not going to go through that. You can read that in terms of the actual. There's like the prisons of the whole story of going to prison. Malta. The Silk Letter Conspiracy is detailed in English. There's a whole number of books in English on that as well that you can read about. But then they get back. So when they get back in the 1919, 1920, around that time period, that's when Shaykh al-Hind comes back as the hero because he makes it back. A lot of the figures Maulana Madani mentions that in India, they had given up hope. They said either they're going to kill him or they're going to put him in life in prison. So they're already doing bara'ah from him. So in India, a lot of the ulama and people were saying that we don't want nothing to do with him. He's not our guy.
In order to save themselves.
Save themselves, exactly. And so when he came back, he goes, they were all embarrassed because they spent all this time doing bara'ah from him, saying, oh, we got nothing to do with him. So now he comes out as a hero. Every station, there's thousands of people waiting for him. And then that's when the Khilafah committee starts in India, the Khilafah movement. So they give him the title of Shaykh al-Hind. So he becomes known as Shaykh al-Hind after that. So when we say Shaykh al-Hind, he was never known as that during his lifetime. It was right near the end of his lifetime. He was getting very old. And that was his whole passion, was that we need to get rid of the British. And that's our goal. Even if it means working with Hindus. This is important now. Because Maulana Madani is referred to as a nationalist scholar. When they say nationalist scholar, it can have a bit of negative connotation to where we hear it.
Yeah.
Nationalism, what they mean by it is that the idea of the British was a divide and rule.
Yeah.
So the way they justified their rule in India was, and Maulana Madani keeps alluding to this, is that they would say to the Hindus, that look, before the Muslims were foreigners, they ruled you, they oppressed you. Now we're more just. All right? So, the Muslims are not your friends. They were your occupiers.
Yeah.
So Maulana Madani alongside Abu Kalam Azad and these figures, they said, no, you're misreading the history of India. The Muslims that came to India, they were either indigenous converts or those who came, they treated as their homeland. So the Muslims are part of the Indian Qawm. Right? They're part of the Indian, by the way, this is not agreed upon. Right? So you have scholars that are against it, just to explain his argument, right? They're part of the Indian Qawm, the Indian people. The British are foreigners, they're trying to usurp the land and take its benefits back. So they're not Indian, they're foreigners. So the Hindus and Muslims and other minorities, they come together as being one people.
As Indian,
but with their own faiths.
yes.
All right? So they're muttahid qawmiyat. So they are a united composite nationalism. Right? That's what we call it, composite nationalism. So we're different people, different religions, but one qawm.
With one national identity.
Now one national identity, right. And then he justifies it in the Quranic thing. So when the Anbiya would say to the people, Ya qawmi, and they're qawm kuffar, but they're still one qawm. So he goes, this is what India are. So we need to unite with Hindus. So if you look at throughout this discourse, he situates everything as a Muslim-Hindu endeavor with the British as a big evil. So Hindus are not spoken about in ill in this view because he's trying to bring that together. Even the jihads of the 20th century, Sayyid Ahmed Shaheed and Shah Ismail Shaheed, he even tries to present that within this idea of, the idea wasn't to establish an Islamic state as making Hindus into minorities, or sorry, Hindus as cast them aside and to rule over. Rather, it was to get rid of the British. So he even reads that into those jihads, which is a highly controversial reading of that. Yeah. But that's the idea that Maulana Madani is pushing, is that we need to work with Hindus, Muslims and Hindus to work together to oust the bigger evil, and then we will decide amongst ourselves as to how to build a nation. Naturally, when it comes to establishing an Islamic state, then that's really off the... It's not that he's against the idea of Islamic state, obviously, right? But that's not on the table.
It becomes very difficult to do.
Because we're a minority anyway,
yes.
Right? So we're going to work with the Hindus, oust the British, and then try to work for our rights within this qawm that we're living in. That was the idea that Maulana Madani was saying. Now, of course, this was opposed. Maulana Ashraf Ali Thanwi famously opposed the idea of Muttahida Qawmiyat, when Maulana Zafar Usmani writing his response to him in Arabic is Fani ala Sunan and other works. And this is where Allama Iqbal also has a back and forth with Maulana Madani on this exact point as well. This is all documented in the biography of Maulana Madani by Barbara Metcalf. And the English biography of Barbara Metcalf, I'll share the PDF for those on Telegram channel. You can read that in more detail. So that's one thing, which is why he's called a nationalist scholar, because he's talking about Hindus and Muslims coming together as forming a qawm. And this is what most of the Deoband scholars were associated with. Mufti Kifayatullah, they brought in the idea. And then the seeds of this is pushed by Shaykh al-Hind, who's saying we need to work with Hindus and Muslims to work together as united, and then fight against the British to oust them. The second thing is significant is that what is known as Tarkul Muwalat. So when Shaykh al-Hind comes back in the 1920 to India, you have the movement of the boycott movement, Tarkul Muwalat, to boycott British products and the British government, basically, right?
Yeah.
So if you had a job which was to do with a government job, or you had your kids,
auditor, for example,
as an auditor, the joke is our cameraman's an auditor, right? By family lineage.
Family lineage.
Yeah. You lost my trail of thought now. Right.
If you had a job.
So you work for the government, or you worked for, you sent your kids to state schools, or products, right? You cut that off. So the fatwa of Shaykh al-Hind, I don't know if it's there in English as well, but the whole fatwa is reproduced of Tark al-Muwalat. Again, not everyone agreed to it, but this became the dominant fatwa. And so boycotting was something that was advocated very early on amongst the senior Deoband scholars. So when people talk about boycotting now Israeli products, it's not analogous between the two. But the idea of boycotting for a greater good is clearly there.
Yeah.
What we're not analogous is the fact that, government jobs, etc., is a bit more, because you're not doing tark muwalat of the Israeli government, but you're not doing tark or boycotting the government of Britain.
Yeah.
Despite their agreement, despite them being
Allied.
to some degree allied to Israel. But there is so the idea of boycotting is very much part of the Deoband tradition.
Yeah.
Right, it's just something highlighted. So Tark al-Muwalat is called. Just Google Tark al-Muwalat, you'll find information, articles on it. The fatwa of Shaykh al-Hind is also reproduced within the Urdu as well near the end. Again, those who are interested, I can give them the page numbers. So that's a significant part of it. And last thing I'll say, because we're taking too much time because we've got Maghrib coming up, right?
Yeah.
Is this connection that Maulana Madani has with his teacher, Maulana Mahmud Hassan. And that relationship is very strong. It's interesting because when I was reading the biography written by Maulana Yusuf Rurgat on Maulana Yusuf Mutada rahmatullah alayhi, most of the biography was about Sheikh Zakaria, despite him being a biography of Maulana Yusuf. Similarly, when you read about Maulana Madani, a lot of this is about Maulana Mahmud Hassan.
Yeah.
Because it shows you the impact that they had on their lives.
Yeah.
So he talks about near the end where he kind of was with Maulana when he comes back from prison, from the prison of Malta, there for about 3.5 years. He's there now, so he's doing khidmah of Maulana Mahmud Hassan. And so Maulana Mahmud Hassan says to him, look, there's a post come up in Calcutta, someone has to go. So everyone's making excuses, no one wants to go. Remember, in Deoband, they like Deoband. Deoband's a comfort zone, right? So people didn't want loads of money. Shibir Osmani goes, look, my mum says I can't go, literally, right? Because my mum's not giving permission. And so then Maulana Madani said, well, why do you not want to go? He goes, because I basically, the whole purpose of me staying was to do your khidmah, right? So he goes, that's not good enough, you go, right? So he has to end up going. So it's an interesting story he mentions is that when he's on his way there, this is in English as well, right? I had to check it out. There's a debate taking place, right? Between a Sunni versus Shia debate. And this is in the peak of the Khilafah movement beginning. So he's invited to go and have a debate. And so I will read the Urdu for you, but it's going to take too long. What's interesting, he goes, look, I didn't want the debate to take place because right now, Muslims need to unite. Yeah. So I didn't want, but if I go there and say, don't debate, people say, this guy is being soft to the Shia.
You're running away.
No, not running away. He's soft to the Shia.
Oh.
Right? Because what's going to happen is that they're going to say, you're trying to align with the Shia. That's your intention, right? You're not being harsh enough as you should be. Yeah. So he goes, I said, all right, I'll go and I'll speak. So when he spoke, he goes, I said to him, I go, look, our debates are there, but the Britain are not discriminating between Shia and Sunni, right? When they're going to take over the haram is both our harams. So, let's play it down, right? This is not the time for it. This is the time that we work together, which I found quite fascinating because if you read the Shia and Sunni discourse in the subcontinent, it's very harsh.
Yeah.
So for someone to, and many times rightly so, because of some of the rhetoric that Shia come out with, but for Maulana Madani to use that time to kind of say, look at the bigger picture. And so again, we can take lesson from it. Again, none of these situations are analogous to, we can't say, therefore Iran, therefore this. I'm not saying that, but it's just taking lessons from this. So we can take lessons to say, okay, he did that. Can we find some sort of lesson that we can take and be applicable where sometimes we're kind of focused in on these smaller disputes where there's something much more greater going on, which is affecting both of us, or sometimes our debate, what's the fruit of it compared to if we did something better with our time. So it's something just to keep a lesson of, which I found quite interesting. Yeah. But then Maulana Madani, he goes off, so he's on his way, and then as he's gone, Shaykh al-Hind passes away. So he passes away, and then he mentions at the end, and this will come right to the end of the book, right? He mentions that he missed the janazah of his sheikh. So he goes, when I got there, he goes, about 9 o'clock, he goes, Deoband पहुंचा, I go to Deoband. हज़रत रहमतुल्लाह अलैह की दौलत के पर जब पहुंचा तो देखा कि लोग दफन से फारिग होकर वापस आ रहे हैं. So I saw that they were buried him and they were coming back. So he missed his burial. He goes, अपनी बदकिस्मती और बेचारगी पर इंतहाई अफसोस हुआ कि बावजूद सारा साल हाजिर पाशी के शरफ के आखिर वक्त में ना वफात के वक्त हाजिर रहा और ना दफन में शिरकत कर सका. So he goes, despite me dedicating my last few years with Muhammad Sheikh al-Hind, I couldn't spend those times with him. So anyway, so this is something that the connection that he has with the Sheikh is something that plays a pivotal role for us. So even a biography of Sheikh al-Hind is provided within the autobiography of Maulana Madani himself. So there's a lot of lessons to take from it, inshallah. But I'll leave it at that. I would advise people to read, those who don't know Urdu, to read Naqsh Hayat, and those who are the English, and those who know Urdu, and especially those who want to talk about Deoband.
Yeah.
So if you want to talk about being Deobandi, whatever, right? Then you want to actually go read about who these people were in their day-to-day time, what their temperament was like.
Yeah.
There's going to be large sections of the book which are going to be a bit just like history of Britain in India.
Yeah.
So what might be a good thing to do is if someone could write an Urdu mukhtasar of the autobiography and take a lot of those information, which is not about Maulana Madani's own life, right? Just to get the biography part. I'm sure people have done that, maybe Allah knows best. And maybe a translation of that may be useful as well. But other than that, I think it's something that everyone should take time out and read, inshallah.
Definitely. And I think taking inspiration from scholars past, agreements and disagreements aside, and personalities aside, is something which is found in our tradition widely. And just as we can take inspiration from classical scholars, then we can take also inspiration from scholars of recent history.
Yeah.
Much more so because we can relate to them in a much closer fashion in the way that they did things and the context in which they lived. Now, moving swiftly forward because of time.
So what we'll do,
Yeah.
because we did say we'll do the autobiography of Zafar Usmani,
Yes.
we can we can delay that to the next episode.
Yeah, we'll
it's not
do
going to be justice doing that in 5 minutes.
No, it
Right,
won't.
so I think
And
it's
we've only got
unfair.
like 15 minutes.
Yeah, if that.
If
So
that.
I think what we'll do is because we're doing from Asr to Maghrib, so people don't know, that's why we're in a short time. So I think we'll keep the autobiography of Zafar Usmani for next episode, inshallah. We'll begin off that. It's very nice because it's a bit different type of figure, because this is more political activism. There's more of an academic, although there's political activism in there as well. So just to talk a bit more about him would be good. I think we should move on to
Yes.
these works, inshallah.
So you got two books in front of you,
Yeah.
both about the Israeli lobby in
Yes.
America. One's by Mr. Pape,
yes.
and one is by a famous political scientist called Mersheimer in Qumran,
And Stephen Walt.
and Stephen Walt. So now, the Zionist lobby in America is known as very powerful, very, very influential, very wealthy. What were your main takeaways, just so that we can finish?
Interesting, yeah. So we just, this will be more again of a shout out to read and just give you some background to the book, inshallah, rather than a critical. I made a number of notes on both books, especially this one. So this is the classic, in essence, has become. So everyone that talks about the Israel lobby usually refers to this book by Mersheimer and Stephen Walt, which is like an article and expanded into a book. Highly controversial because it kind of exposes the Israel AIPAC lobby. But what this book argues for, there's two ways you can approach the anti-Israel discourse in America, right? Or in my mind, at least, right? You have one is a moral argument, which is what we usually make. Look, there's a genocide going on, the evil, they're doing and we can list all the evils of Israel. But the reality is that a lot of people just don't care.
Yeah.
There's a lot of death going on. So some people say, but what about Sudan? And what about Ukraine? And what about this country, that country? So I can't sit there and worrying about every country, right? So although the argument is effective, but then there's a lot of effort required to get the person morally interested in the discourse. The second argument, and part of this is that we have to realize is that US is the central figure in all of this.
Yes.
So even when we're doing our activism in Britain and we can get the government on side, the British government is not powerful enough to stop genocide. There's been multiple calls of ceasefire. The British government, it's the US that are the main suppliers, etc. So the discourse
the hegemony.
So the discourse in the US is where it's pivotal.
Yeah.
So the second argument, so trying to get all the US public on side and look at the genocide, Look, there's some people just don't care. Yeah. Some people they don't mind death being done, or they actually support it in the sense that Muslims dying, who cares?
Yeah.
The second argument, which is that to say it's not in your interest to do so. So here, it's not an argument that you're in the moral right or moral wrong. It's the argument is that it's not worth the
it's a
US
nationalist argument.
It's a national argument. Yeah, it's not worth. So what this book does, Mersheimer, he doesn't make a point, or he doesn't. The argument isn't look how evil Israel is, therefore US should not support Israel. It's more to do with the fact that it's not in our interest to support Israel, and how supporting Israel has cost the US, and how Israel has been a reason for the loss of life, loss of our economy being suffering, going into wars and being hated by the world population, the Middle East and these kind of population, right? Yeah. So Israel in anything. So he's made a case, a nationalist case.
Yeah.
So therefore, you can be someone who hates Muslims, right? Doesn't like them. Or you may talk to someone who doesn't like Muslims, for example, and say, all right, no worries, right? But here, I'm not making a point of care about Muslim lives,
Yeah.
right? I'm going to show you what the Israeli lobby has done and how it's come at the cost of the US support.
American interest.
American interest, exactly. So he talks about how much money they've spent, how many battles, how many wars they had to get into, illegal wars, how many US personnel were lost their lives, right? Army people, they love the veterans, etc. So how many people lost their lives, American soldiers. So all of that is kind of listed and argued of why a case against America allying with Israel from a nationalist stance.
Which in America, in some ways, is a stronger way of argumentation than the moral argument.
100%. So I think sometimes, because of course, naturally, as Muslims, we are linked to our emotion and our akhirah. So we sometimes think that other people think like us, which is not the case, right? We have a moral compass. Most people don't. So we want to speak to people and say, all right, you don't maybe care about lives, but what you do care about is what your national interest is. You love being an American. So this is basically a case for that. So I would advise people to spend, it's a large work, very large work, right? In terms of quite small writing as well. So it's quite large. It'd be quite difficult for someone to read. It's quite tedious to read. So I would kind of say to someone that at least read that couple of chapters, you will get the gist of the argument. So if you want to make a case against someone, understand what the negative impact of the Israel lobby has been on the US, not just the power of it. This work, which is, you can see is much larger, right? But I would say it looks larger, but I think the typesetting is a bit bigger or a bit spread out, so it's not that much of a difference between the two, but it looks much more thicker. This is about Ilan Pappé, which is called Lobbying for Zionism on Both Sides of the Atlantic. This is a history of it. Ilan Pappé does talk from a moral perspective as well, the evils of Israel, because he speaks very much against genocide, etc. So his argument is different to how the way Meir Shams, if you listen to Meir Shams' interviews as well, you see he doesn't make much moral argument. You can clearly see he's disgusted by things, but he doesn't make that kind of argument. It's just about interests. Whereas he's much more into the actual evils of Israel. And this is a thorough history of where the lobby begins. So it's actually interesting is it starts here in East London, Whitechapel, right? Where these in the late 19th century or mid-90s, where the original starting of lobbying begins in Britain, because that's where it starts. It starts here. Right, and how the initial steps are taken to how we get to the Balfour Declaration.
Wow.
So it discusses that. So it's roads and stuff we recognize, places we go visit. Right, you could just in Whitechapel, these kind of areas. I was quite baffled by it. Right, and then he goes through the lobby. So what I would advise people to read, if you're not going to read the whole book, right, is that you read the beginning chapter, and then they've got a chapter. He's got a chapter later on which is called Lobbying for Israel in the 21st Century America, where you can see the last 25 years. So if you don't want to read like a good 100-year history, the last 25 years more recent, names are more familiar, because naturally if I start talking about presidents and stuff or from the 1960s, we probably won't be aware of those names. 20, 25 years ago, still names that ring a bell. You heard of Clinton, you've heard of these names a bit more, it's more Arafat, so you can relate to them more. So it kind of talks about those figures. And I found one part, which are quite sad and fascinating, is that they talk about the way that, during the second Intifada that we spoke about earlier in some of our podcasts, you have this reaction by Israel. And so Bush comes out, Bush Jr. at that time during his thing, and he mentions some harsh remarks against him, that you need to calm down, basically. So then the lobby gets his work, AIPAC, they start, right? And then he comes back and then he has to say, basically, so the reason why they were upset was Israel should not be told to rein in when there's active violence being done against us, right? And so when you read it, it's the exact same words that are used 25 years later about Hamas, saying, allow us to do what we've done because we've got this threat.
Yeah.
And of course, naturally, any people that you occupy, there's always going to be a threat.
Because you're occupying them.
Because you're occupying them. So therefore, just let us carry on. Yeah. So that same argument, so when I was reading it, I had to stop and I took a point here. I was like, it's on page 342. And I was looking at that and I was like, okay, that sounds so familiar to what we hear. And actually a lot of it sounds familiar. So it's quite, I would say, read those two chapters. It's not too expensive. Books are decently priced. Do take some time out, read them. And you can add this to a list of books on Israel Palestine that we've gone through many of the episodes in the past, inshallah.
And with that, we wrap it up. We bring this episode to an end. As mentioned at the beginning, please do follow our Telegram channel where all of the links and documents will be posted so that people can read them and access them and engage with them. Please leave a comment with any kind of suggestions of books that you want us to review in forthcoming episodes, and with your own reflections on books that you may have read that we discussed today as well, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullahu khairan. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.